Now, our speaker this evening is Professor Caroline McCracken-Flesher, Professor of English at the University of Wyoming in Laramie. She took her MA at Edinburgh, and her writing on Scottish literature is published widely. Her books include Possible Scotland's Walter Scott and the Story of Tomorrow, and the Doctor Dissected, Cultural Autopsy of the Burke and Hare Murders. I first met Caroline when she came to Abbotsford and Bow Hill last year with the Clan Scott Society, and she has just received the Clan Scott Society's highest award, the Order of the Stag. The award recognises her outstanding scholarship and study of Scottish literature, particularly that of Sir Walter Scott. She regards Sir Walter Scott as a flexible and generous thinker, whose genuine voice is in his letters and journals, and she'll be giving a talk at the Scottish Parliament on Scottish literature on November the 24th on the topic of the humanities in a post-human future. And I've no doubt that in that she'll have something to say about Sir Walter Scott as well. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we're very fortunate that she is here with us, Professor Caroline McCracken-Flesher.
Remark that one of my colleagues immediately commented on the Clan Scott Award and said, well, you're one of the few women who can say they've had a stag party. So, anyway, I want to thank a lot of people before I begin, but I'll be brief. This talk owes a tremendous amount to Abbotsford and the Trust, to the curators and archivists, people like Kirsty Archer-Thompson and Sandra McKenzie. And I'm very grateful to the Edinburgh Sir Walter Scott Club. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be back, and the University of Edinburgh Department of English. And of course the Advocates Library. I couldn't ask for a nicer setting for this talk. I'm trying to live up to it. And as I was thinking about what to say today, I thought very much about the fact that we're giving a student award. And so it's nice to be able to talk about something very new in Scott studies, something that's an opportunity for students who are up and coming. And of course, those of us who have worked on Scott for a long time know that there's a great deal of Scott on which to work. So you might think, don't we have enough? We have the poetry, we have the novels, we have the journal, which is becoming one of my personal favorites, and of course, this is an author who has a monument, and indeed, many monuments. You know, when is there enough? And we shouldn't forget Abbotsford. But Abbotsford, in the hands of the Trust and through the work of people like Douglas Gifford and so on, has been producing even more things for us to study. And most recently, and what I've spent part of the summer doing, was looking at the Abbotsford visitor books. And you might think, what do these have to tell us about Walter Scott? Because after all, the books that are available to us begin in 1833, and they run until 1935. Well, that's a good 100 years. However, you've probably noticed the problem that Scott was dead before these visitor books get developed. However, I would suggest to you that they stand very much at the center of something that is considered a problem in Walter Scott studies. And it's a problem articulated in advance of the data by Thomas Carlyle. This is the young Thomas Carlyle, pretty much as he would have been when he was grumpily saying in 1838 that, or deriding, Walter Scott writing daily with the ardor of a steam engine, that he might make 15,000 pounds a year and buy upholstery with it, to cover the walls of a stone house in Selkirkshire with knickknacks, ancient armor, and with genealogical shields. What can we name it but a being bit with delirium of a kind? And if there was something that he hated more than the house, it was the tourism. So he also said, Abbotsford, he went on, Abbotsford became infested. This little passage repays close reading, became infested with tourists, wonder hunters, and all that fatal species of people. Solitary Ettrick saw itself populous. All paths were beaten with the feet and hoofs of an endless miscellany of pilgrims. As many as 16 parties have arrived at Abbotsford in one day, male and female. Mr. Lockhart thinks there was no literary shrine ever so bepilgrimed. And I think, given the tone, I really want to pronounce that bepilgrimed. He really was not at all attracted by this aspect of Abbotsford. He wasn't entirely wrong. I skipped over this, sorry. Because this is Abbotsford in 1812, and we debate whether it's called Cartley Hole still, or Clardy Hole, as the locals preferred, or Abbotsford. And Scott in 1811 says, if I build, just as Carlyle might expect, if I build, I must have money. And I know none will give me any but the booksellers. So I must get up into my wheel like a turnspit, or lose the pleasant prospect of one day placing roast mutton before you at Abbotsford. And it's an image of actually becoming part of the machine, like a little hamster, like a turnspit, in order to produce hospitality. And there is no doubt, whether Carlyle liked it or not, that Abbotsford was a very welcoming house. Scott said, our house is the least, this is early on, this is 1814, he says, it is the least that ever harbored decent folks since the traditionary couple who lived in the vinegar bottle. But if you come here in summer, we will find a corner for you. And there are delightful walks and fine views in our neighborhood. So a very hospitable house. And Washington Irving, when he arrived in 1816, said that he set out in the morning ostensibly to visit Melrose Abbey and its vicinity, but chiefly to get a sight of the mighty minstrel of the North. I had a letter of introduction to him from Thomas Campbell the poet, and had reason to think from the interest he had taken in some of my earlier scribblings that a visit from me would not be deemed an intrusion. But this is the early morning, think about it. So you're just showing up at Abbotsford in the early morning with your letter of introduction, and you're saying, oh, I'm just passing through, I'll come back. On the following morning, after an early breakfast, I set off in a post-chaise for the Abbey. On the way thither, I stopped at the gate of Abbotsford and sent the postilion to the house with the letter of introduction and my card. And Abbotsford is as yet but a snug gentleman's cottage, so it's this place with a strange portico, I have to point out. But that disappeared later. Before Scott reached the gate, so Scott actually comes out, he called out in a hearty tone, welcoming me to Abbotsford. He grasped me warmly by the hand. Come, drive down to the house, said he. You're just in time for breakfast, and afterwards you shall see the wonders of the Abbey. And of course, we expect that Irving expected this. I would have excused myself, he says, on the plea of having already made my breakfast. Hoot, man, cried he, a ride in the morning in the keen air of the Scotch hills is warrant enough for a second breakfast. Which, now that I have come across this quotation, makes me think about Abbotsford as if it was kind of Bag End. I'm going to have to work to get that image out of my head. So a very welcoming house, and it welcomed lots of people of whom we know. So that Maria Edgeworth, Wordsworth and Dorothy Wordsworth, James Hogg, and the Miss Edgeworths, they record their visit. They say that they were there with other people. They say they were there with a Prussian prince and a Swiss baron and various neighbors passing through. And this is before it's a big house, so it's a full house. Wordsworth in 1831 sent ahead a nephew of mine, he says. Just think about this. You're going to visit somebody. This is 1831. Scott is already quite ill. And he says, a nephew of mine, a student of Christchurch, and I may add, a distinguished one, to whom I could not but allow the pleasure of accompanying us. The nephew has taken the Newcastle road into Scotland, hoping to join me at Abbotsford. If he should arrive before us, let him be no restraint upon you. Let him loose in your library, or on the Tweed, with his fishing rod, or in the stubble, with his gun. He's but a novice of a shot, by the by. And he will be no trouble to any part of your family. So there are the people who are invited, There are the people they invite, and there are the locals, and there are people nobody ever heard of before, all showing up at Abbotsford. Okay. But Scott really did welcome all sorts of people. We find him saying, "I wrote 2 leaves this morning and gave the day after breakfast to my visitor," John Anstruther Thompson of Charlton and Fife, that was, "who is a country gentleman of the best description, knows the world, having been a good deal attached both to the turf and the field, is extremely good-humoured, and a good deal of a local antiquary. I showed him the plantations, going first round the terrace, then to the lake, then came down by the Rymers Glen, and took carriage at Huntley Burn. Almost the grand tour. The Fergusons dined with us. That was a big day, you would think. But Maria Edgeworth said that I have particularly liked Scott's behaviour toward the variety of guests of all ranks who come to his hospitable castle. Many of these are artists, painters, architects, mechanics, antiquarians, authors, people who look up to him for patronage. His manners are perfectly kind and courteous to everyone. So no matter who you were or how unexpected, mostly Scott implied that he was happy to see you. But across this range of visitors, it wasn't always Abbotsford as we know it. So only the people who came later on toward 1826 would see the Abbotsford we know. As a house, Scott said or Edgeworth said in 1823, she said, "The house is at present in such a state, painting and papering and carpenters finishing the new rooms and chasing the inhabitants out of the old, that it was impossible to have more company than ourselves and odd gentlemen resident at Abbotsford." Right? So they're in the middle of a mess a lot of the time at Abbotsford. And it didn't appeal to everybody. Susan Ferrier, 1829, says that there was more of strangeness than of admiration in my feelings. Too many objects seemed crowded together in a small space, and when this was published, by the way, it got her into quite a lot of trouble. Sir Walter was at pains to relate the history of each and all. He showed me so much and told me so many anecdotes illustrative of the various objects of interest that I retain a very confused and imperfect recollection. So she didn't actually enjoy being part of the big group. So we have 2 things going on here. On the one hand, the welcome to the big group, and then whether the big group itself was internally disruptive. So you find Maria Edgeworth saying, and possibly would have said it of Susan Ferrier had they been there together, she said, when Edgeworth came through Edinburgh on her way to Abbotsford and met Scott in Edinburgh first and had a very nice time here, and so she's talking about the move on to Abbotsford. So in Edinburgh we met that odious Caledonian boor, Mr. Hall, and his wife. We wished them 1,000 times in Jamaica that last evening in Edinburgh, which they spoiled completely. Heaven forbid they should come to Abbotsford while we are there, for which they made great pushes. And Sir Walter hoped sometime or other, Mrs. Hall, etc. He's being polite. But Lady Scott, who I decided I like a great deal, Lady Scott looked blacker than November. She cannot bear any of them. So perhaps Scott was too welcoming, too many people coming. He does ponder this off and on. He says in 1818, "I have been busy with my farming matters and with receiving visitors, chiefly travellers who come to see Melrose. The pleasantest have been a Mr. and Mrs. Hamilton of Dublin. The others were travelling esquires and bankers, and I don't know whom beside, for I think all England is upon a tour this fine season." And yet he also says, "I never grudge, but like to welcome the coming, speed the parting guest. By my will, every guest should part at 10:30. So he liked his visitors, but within appropriate parameters. However, he had very little control of the amount of tourism as time went on, because partly through his own works, he was stirring up an entire industry, as we know. And this book is published first in 1825. This is a later 1830 edition of it. It's the Scottish Tourist, an itinerary and guide to the scenery and antiquities of Scotland and the Western Isles. It's dedicated to Walter Scott, Baronet of Abbotsford, and it features Scott prominently in the introduction as the occasion for touring to Scotland. And this card, we're not positive of the date. It's at least 1839 because it's the George and Abbotsford Hotel. But it gives the toll charges for one-horse carriages, carriage and pair of horses to Abbotsford. One-horse carriage and back is 6 shillings and 6 pence. Carriage and pair of horses, 10 shillings. That's a fair amount of money at the time, actually, to be charging. So locally, the Melrose economy had to be doing quite well out of all these people coming through. But they were all, as you can tell from the title of the hotel, the George and Abbotsford Hotel, aimed at Abbotsford, aimed at things associated with Scott. Well, why Abbotsford and why Scott? We think we know a lot of the answers, but there are cases that provide us with some broader comparative understanding. One of them would be Jane Austen. And Jane Austen is writing at the same time, writing anonymously, so we say, well, nobody really knew. Living within a social circle, not this wide open welcome to all comers wherever you lived, because Scott was equally welcoming in Edinburgh, but particularly associated with Abbotsford. And of course, for Jane Austen, where we associate her is also problematic because she lived in so many places. She lived in Steventon, she lived in Bath, she lived in Southampton, she lived at Chawton. I'm missing somewhere that I can't think of. Godmersham. Right, so there's a whole range of places that you could go if you knew to go, which people didn't necessarily know to go in the 19th century associated with Austen. So the Austen industry doesn't really get going in the 19th century. However, it does get going in the early part of the 20th century. And it gets going first with the 1917 centenary tablet. And we think, well, centenary, that's obvious enough. They want to celebrate the 100 years. Walter Scott was a great one for memorialization, so this fits entirely. But look at the second date, when the house is actually turned into a museum. It's bought and turned into a trust by 1949. These two dates, 1917 and 1949, imply that there's something going on in our association with these authors' houses that's more to do with us than to do with them. That has to do with us giving a local habitation, a representative habitation to concerns and anxieties, and using these places to somehow alleviate them. If we think that this doesn't happen anymore, I should point out Boy George's house in Hampstead, where I had serendipitously, I was walking along the street there just a month ago, and on the wall outside his house, people write on the blocks little messages to Boy George, and they're about, I was at your concert, you mean this to me, you helped me get through this particular trauma. So maybe the only time you hear Scott and Boy George in the same presentation, so seize that moment. But again, authors' houses represent things about them and about us. And so what does Scott's house represent that produces the visitors about which we will talk in a moment? Susan Stewart, this is the only talky slide, I promise. Susan Stewart, in her book On Longing, says, talking about the landscape and things that are beyond our comprehension and difficult to contain, she says that we fear the world without writing, that somehow we need to write it into control. And she says all description maps the unknown, the things we can't control, onto the known. And as part of that, she says miniaturization, which might mean building houses that are like jewel boxes, for instance. Miniaturization offers a world clearly limited in space, right? So instead of all space, we've got it confined. And frozen, and thereby both particularized, right? It's here. But but also generalized. It connects to all of us for these anxieties, whatever they are. Okay, so what are the anxieties that might be folded into Abbotsford? They're going to sound predictable because Susan Stewart, in theorizing, I think lines up very nicely with what Scott actually does. And we might think about Scott's poetry and his novels as the wide, wide world folded into place, folded into text. Think about some of the poetry. Think about The Lady of the Lake and The Hunt, and listen to the words. Yelled on the view, the opening pack. Rock, glen, and cavern paid them back. To many a mingled sound at once, the awakened mountain gave response. 100 dogs, bayed deep and strong, clattered 100 steeds along. This is the landscape, but it's not a static place. Not only is it full of activity, the landscape itself is giving back sound. It's giving response. Everything is echoing. Everything is alive and textured. This landscape itself is so alive. In the course of this hunt, it effectively leaves the people behind. Listen to these lines. 'Twere long to tell what steeds gave o'er as swept the hunt through Campus Moor. What reins were tightened in despair when rose Ben Leddy's ridge in air. Who flagged upon Bocastle's heath, who shunned to stem the flooded teeth. The hunters are dropping like flies. They can't keep up, so to speak, with the landscape and all its hurry. This is something that illustrations of Scott, by the way, have difficulty grasping. So this is Malisi speeding through the landscape with his fiery cross. Well, you have lots of landscape, and notice how textured it is. And this tiny little person who we can't really get him moving, right? But listen to the language again, because it really does. And in this text, it takes all the running we can do to stay in one place. And as for gaining any traction, even more difficult. It goes, speed, Malisi, speed. The dun deer's hide on fleeter foot was never tied. Speed, Malisi, speed. Each cause of haste, thine active sinews never braced. Bend against the steepy hill thy breast, burst down like torrent from its crest, with short and springing footsteps pass the trembling bog and false morass, across the brook like roebuck bound, and thread the brake like questing hound. The crag is high, the scar is deep, yet shrink not from the desperate leap. And here he's almost he's having to become this active landscape in order to get any way going. And yet, even here, these spaces that we race across to try to contain become places. 'Twere long to tell what steeds gave o'er as swept the hunt through Campus Moor. It's a place, it's a particular spot, and it's a spot in time. What reins were tightened in despair when rose Ben Leddy's ridge in air? Who flagged upon Bocastle's heath? Who shunned to stem the flooded teeth? This is a named landscape. And these places give us a home in history and a home in time, because the people that Malisi is going to fetch have names and they have times. Because young Angus is of Duncragan, and he's coming from the bier of his murdered father. So there's a funeral going on. There's a rite of passage, right? So an important moment in time. Norman is the heir of Armandave, and he is snatched from his wedding ceremony. That's a big day, right? So we have places tied to moments. The things that Susan Stewart says are very, very difficult to get hold of. Now, okay. I give you this because I want you to see what the guidebook that I showed you earlier is like and what it foregrounds. So this is straight off the page. It says, one of the things you must visit, as guided by Walter Scott, is the superb mansion of Walter Scott, Baronet, which appears amid a profusion of oak, birch, mountain ash, etc. Think about those pictures from The Lady of the Lake, which rival each other in youthful vigor. Here, the banks of the Tweed are graced for miles with ranges of forest wood, and one may wander a long day amid the countless charms of Abbotsford's serpentine walks. So we've got nature, but we've got nature with the serpentine, carefully laid out walk. There are waterfalls, ravines, bowers, and benches. Notice how the bowers and benches came in there. Mountain lakes and meandering Tweed are included as attractions for the tourist at this bewitching spot. We have somehow wrangled nature. The tourist will be gratified by a walk in the garden previous to entering the house, or whatever it may be called, for it resembles no other building in the kingdom as a whole. It has an imposing effect, borrowing outlines and ornaments from every part of Scotland. So somehow this place has folded in Scotland, all that space and all that historical time. And if we think about Scott's books, then shelved in Abbotsford, we get even more of that sense of space and time folded in to Abbotsford. That took a lot of running on Scott's part, so that Maria Edgeworth, when she was visiting, and I really recommend that you go read what she says about the visit, she has a lot to say. She says, "The wonder grows every hour upon me, how Scott finds time to do all he does. Look at his plantations, at the extent of wood and miles of walks through his own plantations, which he has made in this place in 12 years, and you would think that he could have done nothing but plant. Look at his buildings, and you would think he could have done nothing but build. All day long he is conversing or walking with us or reading to us. When has he time to write? He says, 'Oh, I have plenty of time. I rise early, at 7 o'clock. And then she does a little calculation that says, 7 o'clock is not early if you're going to do all this stuff. So there's a tremendous pace folded into this place that looks so calm and settled. And as we now turn to think about the later visitors, I would suggest that we want to think about Scott collecting and building and writing the wilderness down into Abbotsford. But you'll also see that there's a problem with those words, because building is an act of creation and writing is an act of creation. So you're folding something down, but potentially it's opening up at the same time. Somebody who really benefited from Scott's ability to fold place or space into place, all that wilderness, is George IV. He gives us a good mark for understanding this. And we all know that when George IV came to Edinburgh in 1822, he was not the most popular guy. And in fact, he left London, that rioted on him on his way out. They were throwing cabbages at him. There he was, involved in the wilderness even in London. And he gets to Edinburgh and is welcomed to a wild place, but in very coded terms. He is encouraged to think of himself as the blood of the Bruce coming over the border, the chief of chiefs, and he gets all kitted out in accordance with that set of stories, and he finds a place, right? He finds a way to be in place in what was for him a rather rough world. This doesn't work for everybody who's associated with Scott. Remember, George IV didn't go to Abbotsford, but he shows us how it works. Felix Mendelssohn did go to Abbotsford, or tried to. And we read from him, "Most astonished friends, oh, most amazed readers, under us," he says, "the great man is snoring. His dogs are asleep and his armored knights awake. It is 12 o'clock. And the sweetest ghostly hour which I have ever spent." For Miss Scott makes the most delicious marmalade. I think that means he has indigestion, actually. And so, "Never was a letter begun with greater relish, and we look down very much on Europe." Right? So he's found his place. It's in proximity to the great man. We look down very much on Europe that doesn't have this pleasure. But then the letter goes on. P.S. And he was traveling with his friend Carl Klingemann. This is all Klingemann's invention. We found Sir Walter in the act of leaving Abbotsford, stared at him like fools, drove 80 miles and lost a day for the sake of at best 1/2 hour of superficial conversation. Melrose compensated us but little. We were out of humor with great men, with ourselves, with the world, with everything. It was a bad day. Felix Mendelssohn. So, on the one hand, Scott and Abbotsford fold all this space into place and help us situate ourselves in the world, but sometimes it doesn't work, and then we might be like Mendelssohn, and at least in his letter, which is quite comic, feel adrift. So a wild world at Abbotsford, inscribed in books, where people, after Scott's death, when they can't visit him, are trying to inscribe themselves. And this is Charles Dickens. Queen Victoria also came and wrote her name on the flyleaf of the journal. Apparently she had to be persuaded into it, which is to her credit. But in the Abbotsford guest books, and I'm very grateful to Abbotsford for permission to share these images, there are big names. So for instance, by the arrow you will see Herman Melville. He had just completed and published Moby Dick, and here he was going to Abbotsford. People you might not expect to find, because we all know what Mark Twain thought of Walter Scott, right? He blamed Scott, at least humorously, for being responsible for the American Civil War by encouraging people to think romantically. So you wouldn't necessarily expect him to go to Abbotsford. But this summer, as I was going through the guest books, and we were looking both at trends and at individuals, we thought, wouldn't it be fun if we could find some unexpected people? So we started to dig through other people's letters, and we digged through Mark Twain's wife's letters. And she says, we're off to Abbotsford in a couple of days with Mr. Russell, the editor of The Scotsman. So I went back to the books and did some digging. And in the Abbotsford guest books, every so often you know that something has been noted because there's a big X beside it. Well, Mark Twain escaped remark because he signed as Samuel Clemens, as he would. So we didn't previously know he was in the guest books. There he is. And by the way, in the same letter where his wife says we're off to Abbotsford, Clemens says that they've just got their 1829 volumes of Abbotsford, pretty scarce book, and he's really looking forward to it. There are histories in the Abbotsford guest books of people you'd never expect. This is audience involvement, so I'm going to ask, does anybody know the name Farragut? Yes? Okay, and the name Farragut means? Who's it connected to?
Union Naval Commander in the Civil War.
Excellent. Good for all of you. I should have asked you all at the beginning. So we went looking, because it sounded vaguely familiar. So we went looking, and indeed, this is the first admiral of the U.S. Navy. And he's the one who, in the Battle of Mobile, says, full speed ahead, damn the torpedoes. And after he had accomplished that, he came and visited Abbotsford. The Stevensons of Edinburgh showed up, and they were kind enough to give their exact street address, 17 Harriet Row. This would have been the year when Stevenson himself was on his way to university, and so it's September. Session probably hadn't started yet. It's curious to wonder whether Stevenson and party had a grumpy Robert Louis Stevenson along with them. He was 16 after all. And then there are things like this. Suddenly, in the middle of a page, this is the only thing like this we've so far found, is a label. And the label is for Professor Libby Tours. And below the label, everybody is listed from Spartanburg, South Carolina, and on over the page. Now that was fun, but yesterday I found this, which is clear the year before. Clearly, Professor Libby had been dying to stick his label in there because he'd been sketching it in the year before. But that's not even the most interesting thing. So if we're folding the wild world down into Abbotsford, these signatures produce unexpected things. Professor Libby, a couple of years later, is on the dock in Chicago when the SS Eastland, which is taking I think it's a General Electric or some such company, summer trip on the lake. There are 2,800 people on the ship, and the ship overturns against the dock, and 800 people drown. And Professor Libby is there. He gets interviewed by his hometown paper, the Spartanburg Herald. And he tells them what happened. He tells them that he was of assistance because he ran the pull motor on the people that they were bringing back to shore. And then he says, just as we're all getting very distressed, he says, and of course it would have worked a whole lot better if they had allowed me to administer the pull motor for the full hour, which is what it needs. So he thought that after an hour you could bring somebody back from drowning if you inflated their lungs enough. So that's Professor Libby. But through these books then, the past suddenly erupts in big stories through unexpected people. The miniature is opening out into the massive. And this is the story of Mr. Hoyt of Chicago. Mr. Hoyt visited Abbotsford, H.W. Hoyt. Look him up and you discover that a couple of years later, his lumber yard, also in Chicago, was the scene of race riots because Mr. Hoyt had been hiring black workers and the Irish workers rioted. So Mr. Hoyt, good for him, came to Abbotsford. You can track him forward. In 1883, Mr. Hoyt runs a Christmas dinner for his workers. And we found, there's the card. There's also a Hoyt, so projecting forward even a little longer, H.W. Hoyt becomes a thing. There are a lot of H.W. Hoyts in Chicago. This one worked as the vice president and secretary for the Great Lakes Engineering Works. And subsequently, there's an H.W. Hoyt of Chicago who drowns in Venezuela. Now, you think, what are the connections between those things? Well, we don't know. We do know that here's a name running forward from the Abbotsford guest books. We know that it's a really interesting name. It could conceivably be that these people are successive generations. And isn't that fascinating, how this one line in a guest book opens out? Let's see. However, not everyone is looking to belong. If you were close, you could see that the top line here says, Colonel Flapdoodle of Bootle, Japan. I'm pretty sure, Google has not yielded Colonel Flapdoodle, so I'm pretty sure that he was basically joking in the book. But every name that we have, let me see, I think I may have skipped a couple. Every name that we have, every visit, and every name constrains, on the one hand, right, puts something into the book, but opens up this wider world. And the guest books, so here's a quick run through them. The guest books are fascinating in many, many ways, not least because if you knew that your aunt, great-great-great, had visited Abbotsford, and if you knew roughly when, you might be able to find them. And if we can get these digitized, you could be able to search to see who came from where, whether your town was well represented and when. And just to give you some examples, you'll find that, for instance, there was a day in 1891 in June where a whole lot of people came from Edinburgh. A whole group. What was that group? Eventually, we think we're going to be able to figure out, was that a trip from an office? Was it a church? Was it, I'm sure you can think of options. And they go on over the page and keep going. Or here, this is a particularly interesting one. This is the Sterling Master Builders group. all came to Abbotsford. So to write in an Abbotsford guest visitor book is to write yourself into place, but place opens out into ungovernable space. Scott always did his best. We saw that at the beginning, right? He was very welcoming. But he couldn't guarantee things were going to work out well. And we find him in 1816, quite early, saying that bad weather served to increase the dismay of our unlucky visitors, who, accustomed only to Paris and London, expected fiacres at the Milestone Cross and a pair of oars at the Dead Man's Heugh. Add to this a strong disposition to gossip, these were the French relatives, the Dumurgs, where there was no possibility of gratifying it, and a total indisposition to scenery or country amusements, which were all we had to offer, and you will pity both visitors and guests. I have the gratification to think I fully supported the hospitality of my country. I walked them to death. I talked them to death. I showed them landscapes which the driving rain hardly permitted them to see, and told them of feuds about which they cared as little as I do about their next-door news in Piccadilly. So you can put in all that welcoming effort, and the rain will still fall. So Abbotsford stood against, but always opened the doorway to, the wilderness that was nature, and also civilization in all these visitors. It was this way from the start. Scott says, even before he's really moved in 1811, he says, "We are busied on all hands making preparations to remove next season to our princely domain of 100 acres at Abbotsford. Like other potentates, I have had to defend my realm against invasion, and that against no less powerful a foe than Father Tweed himself." So, at Abbotsford, there's a world of possibility, inside and out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Caroline. That's absolutely fascinating. I think that's opened many doors and windows into Abbotsford and its visitors over the years. But I would be surprised if it has not tickled your fancy to ask Caroline to clarify anything that she has said. So please take this opportunity, ladies and gentlemen. It may not come again to take advantage of Caroline being here with us. Please.
I'm a very new student of Sir Walter Scott, and this is just fascinating. I wondered how much information there is out there about Lady Scott at all.
Not as much as we'd like, right? And I think there are a number of Scott scholars in the room who can help answer. One of the things I was delighted to find as I was working on this project and thinking more about Susan Ferrier visiting the house, Mariah Edgeworth, and so on, is that they do have things to say about Lady Scott that I think we've sort of neglected. And Mariah Edgeworth in particular is not sure what to make of her when she first meets her in Edinburgh. And so they arrive in Edinburgh, they go to Scott's house, they're asked to come over immediately, they arrive in the middle of one of those big parties, you know, and Mariah Edgeworth has a great time, but they're kind of shell-shocked. And then the next morning, Lady Scott shows up, and Mariah Edgeworth says that she's, you know, Lady Scott in rouge and feathers, and there's something else, you know, the full style on in Edinburgh, walking along to see them. And then later at Abbotsford, she says that she's not sure what to make of Lady Scott because her hands are always moving, whether it's because she still doesn't have very good English, which was interesting, or whether it's her French expressiveness. Her hands are always moving, always, you know, touching things and so on, touching her clothes. But later again, she says that she thinks that Lady Scott is much misunderstood, which I find doubly interesting because that means that's the discussion about Lady Scott at the time is not tremendously supportive, and here's Mariah Edgeworth learning and thinking to counter that discussion. So I think that there's a lot more to be discovered about Lady Scott.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Yes. One thing that's just struck me, and I've been working recently on the friendship between Scott and Sir David Brewster in Gattinside. And Brewster was a Whig, and a radical Whig scientist, and a very strong Free Churchman. And yet the two managed, for various rather personal reasons, to get on extremely well together. And one of the things that's been puzzling me is the leap forward in the historical grounding of the statistical accounts when it comes to the second statistical account from 1831 on. There's a much greater chunk of civil history in it. And I wonder whether the Barley Broth Club that the two of them founded and dined at one another's houses every weekend, Brewster doesn't tell us, Scott doesn't tell us what they actually discuss. My supposition is that a lot of the discussion was what Scott could learn from Brewster the scientist, and Scott is a real progressive in that sense, and also what Brewster could learn from Scott the historian. And that then emerges in these great chunks of civil history that you get in the second statistical account. I don't think that Sinclair could be much bothered. You know, if it was agricultural yields, great, but not, in fact, the past. But Brewster was fascinated by the past. And one thing that I would suggest to you to have a look at is the exhibition in the National Museum called Victorian Sensation about photography, because Brewster is the godfather of Scottish photography. Not only that, he is the man who goes in for stereoscopic photography, which I think is something that is going to result in the 1850s in the enormous expansion of digging in Scotland to unearth a reality which lies under the surface, because this is a thing which is actually exposed by stereoscopy, which are just lines on a map or hummocks in a field, suddenly become the past, the ascertainable past. And I think that this is a real example of synergy between the two, quite different but complementary men.
It sounded like an alternative speech, but
But I think it's
if you could draw something out of it, it would be enlightening.
You were invited to Melrose.
well, no, I think it's fascinating because this welcome that Scott gives, that Carlyle finds so problematic, because he's talking about the tourism mostly through Scott's life. I mean, he's only writing in 1838, and Scott is relatively recently dead. Is that great hospitality, though, provided the opportunity for all kinds of conversation. And that actually brings me back to Lady Scott, because although she didn't like some guests, evidently she was quite tolerant because the house was always full, right? So it really is a discursive moment. Although I should say that one of the guests that Scott did not care for, and there were very few, but one that he did not care for was John Sinclair, because he found to Scott, Sinclair was the great Caledonian Boar. But he came anyway.
Please.
It's interesting to visitors' books, because there is, of course, another place where in Scotland, another author's place where visitors went and have the records, and that's the Burns Cottage. And picking up your American Civil War theme, I wonder if any comparison has been done, because Burns Cottage had as visitors Jefferson Davis, Mrs. Lincoln, and Ulysses S. Grant on his memoirs, selling his memoirs. And I wondered if one were there at Abbotsford, and two, it'd be interesting to do a comparison.
Well, we know that Ulysses S. Grant did go to Abbotsford. I'm not sure. One of the things, we've really only begun work on the guest books, and it will make a huge difference if we can get them digitized and in a searchable form, because and things for the Burns Cottage and so on, because then we'll really be able to cross-reference. And that's what I thought I was going to do when I started working on these. I thought I was going to see these trends. I thought I was going to be able to network. And they are vast. I mean, it's 100 years of visitors. And so really this is the dipping the toe in, where you could see waves of people coming from Edinburgh or from Motherwell. Motherwell seemed to find Abbotsford fascinating. They were frequently coming. But at the same time, these names that are popping out, some of them really did pop off the page. And so, you catch them. But at the level where we're trying to record this quite quickly in order to work with it, the other way was to think about, wouldn't it be odd if Mark Twain actually visited, and then try to go backward. But there's a vast amount of information in there, a lot for any interested student to pursue. I think there are whole waves of possibility that are not just literary, but are to do with sociology, with tourism, all kinds of things I think can be enlightened through the Abbotsford guest books.
Professor McCracken, that was wonderful. Today's National Poetry Day, so I thought your reading of something from the last minstrel Lady Blake was very, very good. It almost reminded me of the same cadences of maybe Scott had been reading Tam O'Shanter's one or two areas of that in the night before, because it reads in this wonderful graphic way at the same time. Anyway, that by the by. 1 year ago, the Scott Club held a wonderful talk about the way that Walter Scott, when a younger man, was doing various editions or tryouts of his early minstrelsy on all the big houses and the grand houses around Edinburgh and the Lothians. So although he seems to be just being himself to give a performance, just to visit and be at home to conversations with his guests, may we know whether at Abbotsford did he give performance nights, like recitation nights, or did he give musicals, or did he give recitations? I mean, people just seem to land and want to be stayed, but did he actually have the odd evening of a cultural performances and readings?
Well, I actually want to share this question with my colleagues in Scots Studies, because I think there are those who can answer it better than I can. What I can talk about is that when people visited, there often was a lot of entertainment going on, although it did occasionally take the form of, as Anne talks about Sophia and the everlasting, the harp, she would just put it away. But Mariah Edgeworth and Susan Ferrier talk about the same song and dance with the handkerchiefs and so on. Scott did not perform his own work when he was a novelist, though, because, of course, it was still mostly closely held among a few, that knowledge. But Siggy, you'll know about him performing his actual poetry.
Yes, it is. One of the things you said before, that the ladies become very important here, because Anne, his daughter, she was to perform a certain number of songs after each visit, and because there were too many, that she complained it's turning into a tell, and she's a performer and she didn't want that. So she had problems with it. So Sophia was the one for the real sort of emotional type of ballad singing, and Anne was the one who was sort of the better performer, let's put it this way. So we've been looking at the manuscripts, and we've also been trying to trace these people, just like you've been doing for later, that trace these people who were actually present and who were saying something about this. And time and again they were saying that the father decided what was going to be sung, and he would tell the story. And very often he would recite. So Walter would actually recite, especially the Battle of Otterburn. That was one of his favourites. And there are a couple of people who are actually known to have escaped after that. One very famous one, Robert Southey. He couldn't take it any longer, and he just said, okay, after the first night, when he was taken to all these castles, and he said they're all ruins anyway, and he comes up with yet another story about this particular stone. And of course we can vouchsafe that. Emily, who's here as well, we are still completing the minstrelsy because there are so many notes to every single stone he mentions in the minstrelsy. For instance, with the Douglas tragedy, we have 3 stones where we had to identify them. So things like that. So it is, well, sometimes I feel like Robert Southey, get away from it.
But it sounds like, from your perspective, that it's a planned performance with a number of people co-opted to perform.
That's right.
He named 2 of his dogs after Douglas and Percy.
Yeah, because there were actually 2 harps, There were 2 harps, not only one. Because that's important to know, because we were stuck for a time and said, well, where's the other harp? But it actually turned up there is another harp, because otherwise he couldn't perform it once Sophia moved to London.
Oh, right.
Could you say a little bit more about you mentioned the idea of creativity and wilderness? Because some of, when you talk about the serpentine walks and things like that, It sounds like a very controlled presentation of wilderness that Scott is giving in Abbotsford. Could you say a little more about that?
Well, I think what I would say in this context is that yes, it is controlled, but uncontrollable, right? And in fact, I would go back to what Siggy said, and I heard a really lovely paper yesterday from Lucy Linforth talking about Scott and how he envisaged and how other people represented the ruins that he talked about, so that connects back to Siggy, and how there is a containment going on the one hand, but of course the thing is still crumbling or has to be reconceived, and you really don't have control. You have the illusion of control. In fact, there's some very interesting work being done at Abbotsford at the moment in terms of those very serpentine pathways, where Pippa, who's in charge of grounds, is trying to figure out where did they go. We have reasonable notion of where they went, but she and another scholar are actually reading through Scott's writings of various kinds to try to understand where they were put. But they were very much to do with, those walks are very much to do with, it's the landscaping of the time, right? So that you walk to the prospect, you sit on the bench, you view the prospect. But it is a natural prospect, and so you're always fighting against the rising tide. You know, in Wyoming we have this saying, God willing and the creek don't rise, but the creek always rises.
Of course, Scott didn't like the massive artificial recreation of a landscape. He hated the Capability Brown type of thing, but liked to use the natural features and enhance them. So that would figure. Any other questions?
Wasn't another question, sir? A wee an American observation. Wasn't Herman Melville over to see his Fife ancestors?
He was over here to do a lot of things, including recoup his fortunes, I believe. So yes. And a lot of people did come, and you can see family groups coming. That's the other thing. And then the books pose you these interesting questions, because all of a sudden there's a whole page in the same handwriting. So somebody is clearly seconded to do the entering of the names. Early on, by the way, the handwriting is so regular that you kind of wonder if it was after the fact or if it was the butler or who did that. Right, so there are all kinds of questions here about class, about people's reasons for traveling to Scotland in the first place, about their reasons for coming to Abbotsford. I tried to check if they also went to Bow Hill, but that's unfortunately not checkable. So I am going to be looking at places like the Burns Cottage.
Just another sort of slide of observation. Washington Irving is visits very important because he's the only source of the claim by Scott that he had seen a letter in the Stuart archives, and a letter of invitation from some American colonists to Prince Charles Edward, to King Charles as he was then, to Jacobites to come over. And very interesting, there's lots of scholars who have looked for this letter since, and no one has seen it. And the interesting thing is that Scott claims the letter came from Boston, not as you might imagine from Virginia. And this is the subject of a John Buchan short story, the Company of the Marshland. But it's very interesting. Various scholars have looked, and no one has yet. There are references elsewhere, but no one has seen this letter or known exactly who was it who was thinking of inviting Charles Edward to.
Well, I have a suggestion for you to look.
Yeah.
Because I was at the 19th Century Studies Association in Boston, and there they had a number of people from the Masonic museums in the area, and there are quite a few. So I wonder if those are places to look at for the Scottish Rite museums.
Well, I think we have been privileged to have such a tremendous lecture and such a full answering of your question, but I don't think I'm quite adequate to the task of thanking Caroline, so I'm going to ask Peter Garside if you'd be kind enough to express our gratitude. Peter.
Thank you. Well, Abbotsford, as we all know, has been very much in the spotlight in recent years. Caroline, you've added yet another dimension and offered new insights about this phenomenon. There may be amongst other old lags here, not just myself, who hanker a little bit about the older days at Abbotsford, the days of the two ladies, Patricia and Dame Jean, the familiarities in the sweet shop downstairs, the chance, if you were lucky, of being invited into the living quarters, where on one occasion I nearly stood on the family dog under the impression that it was a hearth rug. But there is no doubt that the recent developments have done an awful lot. The refurbishment of the house, the professionalisation of the preservation, the visitor centre have done an awful lot to improve Scott's international profile, and there have been scholarly knock-on effects as well already. And the way you were talking, one of the things, although I resist the electric glare on things, being a retiring sort, the present situation, in a way, strangely reflects what it must have been like in Scott's day, and then the period afterwards when it became a site of pilgrimage for so many people. I loved your comments on Scott's involvement in movement, the importance of locality, the building and the constant. When you get a pause in Scott's writing, it's very rare and it means a lot. You don't get many pauses. It was hectic. Of course, everybody wonders how did he get all that written at the same time. I think he did. I think he got up at 5 o'clock, not 7 o'clock. He wasn't telling the truth to Maria Edgeworth. He had a steely determination. He could block things off. And of course, he had his other life in Edinburgh, which is not in the glare of publicity, although we had, as a club, a chance to view it, the Castle Street quarters, where, of course, he finished off Waverley and did a lot of his writing. This tends to be obscured. I wasn't aware of the existence of the guest book at all, but it's very interesting to hear about them. I suppose in a way it's a witness to the celebrity Scott had, in spite of Thomas Carlyle, the celebrity he enjoyed, and how he had appealed to so many different sorts of people, aspiring artists, musicians. They must have seen a wonderful example in Scott for getting on in the world, you know. But American industrialists, Boy Scout groups from Edinburgh, what have you, all were drawn by the image of Scott, and you reminded us of that. There's so many other things I could say, but I'm sure the club will join me in thanking again Caroline for a wonderfully entertaining, informative talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. Caroline, I'd very much like to give you this little scarf as a reminder of your visit here, and a wee tie for your husband, and a copy of and a copy of the book of the President's digest of the President's speeches. And thank you again for a wonderful presentation.
And I should say that I'm a proud member, although I don't often attend, of the Edinburgh Sir Walter's Fund.
And thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. Don't hurry away. There will be a chance to refresh yourselves. And here comes the wine and the water. So don't hurry away, but please linger. And if you have any more questions, I'm sure that Caroline will be delighted to discuss them with you. So thank you all very much indeed for coming.